Maplewood-Oranges Alumni chapter of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. On behalf of the brothers of Maplewood-Oranges and our Northeastern province, I bring you greetings and welcome you to today's webinar, COVID-19 and the vaccines. I'd also like to take a little time to acknowledge leaders within our political, scientific, religious, and jurisprudence communities who may be on the call, as well as our fraternity's past and present Grand Board members, our fraternity's past and present chapter poll marks, and other D9 members who may be present. A special welcome to you all. We believe that everyone will find today's program very valuable as we all attempt to navigate our way through this terrible pandemic, which has taken over our lives for as much as a year now. Our speakers are extremely experienced medical professionals who are both well-versed on the topics of COVID and infectious disease in general. I'll be introducing them shortly, but right now I'd like to address one little administrative detail. Protocol requires that we be able to properly identify every person logged onto this event. Thus, please note that if the device you're using does not reflect an actual first and last name, we will contact you privately through the chat to rename it accordingly. We thank you for your cooperation here. Now, before we start today's presentation, I'd like to give the floor to our amazing Northeastern Province poll mark, Brother Christopher Tompkins, who would like to make a few remarks. Brother Tompkins.
Thank you, Brother Bolden. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you for taking a Saturday afternoon to be a part of a discussion that's important to our community and to ourselves, dispelling the myths about COVID-19 and the vaccines. I especially want to thank our panelists, Dr. Dow Hewlett, as well as Dr. Kevin Holcomb, for taking their time to be the panelists in order to field questions and concerns that some of our participants of today's today's town hall to answer those questions. One of the things that was interesting as Brother Bolden and I talked about this event is there are a lot of folks that we know that had concerns about the vaccine. And what better way to dispel those myths by having an opportunity to ask questions that are concerning to them. We've had almost 437,000 people die due to this COVID-19 disease virus. And it probably hit home for a lot of people that are on this call today. For those that have been impacted, who've lost loved ones, my sincerest condolences to you and your families, and you will be in my thoughts and prayers. You know, it is important to take the information that we have here to heart because there are a lot of reservations about the vaccine. One of the questions that came to me from Brother Griffith out of Maplewood-Oranges was, what can I do to convince my family and friends to get the COVID-19 vaccine once available, which is a very frequent question that I do hear. And one of the things I mentioned to him in a response was, this is the proper forum where we have those individuals that could field those types of questions. But my gut feel and response was to lead by example, to make sure that you're going out there and you're getting vaccinated so that they can actually see someone and be able to relate to the fact that someone that they know has gone out there to get vaccinated. You know, one of the things that I kind of hold true to heart too is to trust but verify. When you're hearing things from the scientists, it's good to trust that information, but you also want to verify by constantly reading up, doing your own research, and having those proper conversations with those who are in the field. Having said that, I hope that this event will provide you the comfort that's required by you with regards to any reservation that you might have about COVID-19 and the vaccine. So welcome again, and I appreciate all of you for attending this event today. Thank you, Brother Bolden.
Thank you, Brother Province Paul Mark. Much appreciated, much appreciated. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's about that time for our main event. But before we get started, I'd like to point out just one issue, one administrative issue, that is. All questions may be entertained or actually submitted throughout this program via the chat. All of the speakers, or both of the speakers, will make every effort to answer those questions today. Some of those questions will be responded to after their individual overviews, others after a general Q&A after the presentation is done. But we only ask that you actually submit these questions privately through the chat to a Mr. Kobe Amankwa. That's Kobe Amankwa. There's the name right there. Okay, Kobe Amankwa. In slide. Kobe is an amazing young med student who took time out of his busy study schedule to work with us today. And he's also a member of a phenomenal organization called Black and Latino Men in Medicine. Really appreciate your time today, Kobe. So all we have to do is give the information to Kobe and he'll take care of the rest. Okay. Well, let's get started. Our first speaker, Dr. Kevin N. Holcomb, MD, currently serves as the Associate Dean of Admissions, the Vice Chair of Gynecology, and the Director of Gynecologic Oncology at Weill Cornell Medical College. He is a graduate of both New York Medical College and Cornell University, as well as a proud 1985 initiate of KSI's Iota Phi chapter. Without further ado, I give you our first presenter, Dr. Kevin N. Holcomb. Dr. Holcomb.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Brother Tompkins, Brothers Bolden, Graves, Weber, we really appreciate this opportunity and this platform to do exactly what Brother Tompkins was speaking about. Brother Weber is my brother-in-law, actually, and when he reached out to me about doing this program, I was really excited because I was looking for an opportunity to gain a platform to speak to the people I care about, and I thank the chapter for giving us just that. I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see that? Okay. So I wanted to start off with some basics because I think this will tie very much into the results of the studies on the vaccines, and to clarify the difference between SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. So SARS-CoV-2 is the name of a novel coronavirus that was first identified in 2019. While that seemed to confuse our past president, why it was called COVID-19, it was kind of obvious it was just the year that it was founded. SARS stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome. And this type of virus causes just that. And it's not the first time we've seen this. You guys probably have heard the name SARS before. SARS was, the first one was in 1990, came out of Far East, and it was contained pretty quickly. I think there were only about 8,000 deaths worldwide. And then there was another coronavirus called MERS that came out of the Middle East. And that one was pretty quickly contained as well. And so this is the worst outcome that we've seen from a coronavirus, but it's not the first time we faced a coronavirus. The symptomatic disease, the cough, the fever, the sometimes deadly side effects of that infection is what is called COVID-19. So COVID-19 is the name of the disease, and SARS-CoV-2 is the name of the virus. So Brother Tompkins already mentioned how bad things have gotten. And this slide, unfortunately, just has to be updated every week. We are marching towards 500,000 deaths. We're already over 400,000 currently. And so this has been a worldwide issue, but it has been a deadly pandemic in the United States. Having been a doctor in New York City, the first pandemic epicenter in the US, I can say that it came on very, very quickly. I remember hearing the first case in New York City on March 1st, which was a woman who returned from Iran, strangely enough, not from China. But by the next day, there was already a case in New York City that caught my attention. It was a lawyer who worked up in Westchester. I became very aware of it because he worked in the office building where my wife worked, and they had to evacuate. So I became quite aware of this quickly. But we were in emergency state by 5 days later, by March 7th. Public schools closed by the 16th. The governor had an executive order stopping elective surgeries and maximizing hospital beds by the 23rd. Things really rolled quickly. But one thing I'll point out is that it wasn't until a full month later on March 9th that we started to see race and ethnicity data released on this disease. And that's when it became shockingly obvious that the weight of this disease was not being borne equally in Americans. And we started seeing that Black people and brown people were dying at disparate numbers. And if you look at New York City, you can see the difference between what was happening in Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx compared to Manhattan. Those areas of dark purple in that map are the hardest hit areas in New York City. And of course, the first question was why? Earliest explanations, I remember people saying, well, the comorbidities that we knew from Wuhan that worsened outcomes, obesity, hypertension, cardiac disease, lung disease, that those things are more common in Black and brown communities. And all that's true, but there are equally important explanations. Brooklyn, Bronx, the Queens, they're home to more service workers, more minorities, immigrants living there. And when you look at what's going on in these areas, there's a lot of social determinants that are explaining this disparity. You know, it's very expensive housing in New York City. So you get multi-generational housing in the Bronx, Brooklyn, some of the areas like Elmhurst that were being hit really hard. So grandma's living in the same house as their adult children and their children. This inability to social distance. Interestingly, some studies showed that there was no direct correlation with poverty. These are very often working families and working communities. It should be remembered that when we're celebrating frontline workers for being at the highest risk, these are disproportionately people of color. 75% of frontline workers in New York City are people of color. Greater than 50% of healthcare workers are Hispanic and Black. You look at the MTA, the transit workers, 40% Black, 26% Hispanic, 10% Asian. And we lost a large number of those workers. Many became ill during the first wave of the pandemic. And not surprisingly, as you see more cases and more hospitalizations, the lagging, more important metric is deaths. And you see highest deaths among people of ethnic minorities in the country. So whereas Hispanics are 29% of the population, they represent about 34% of the deaths. Blacks, 22%, this is New York City, of the population, 28% of the deaths. And then you see what you'd expect on the other side. It's one pie being divided, so whites and Asians are underrepresented in the number of deaths. And so I bring this up because when we get to speaking about the vaccine, we're going to be talking about weighing risks and benefits. And I think it's important, and I'm sure most of you realize that we are a high-risk group. I just wanted to give some basic background in vaccines. I think most people know how vaccines work, but a vaccine is just a way of showing your immune system a little snapshot, and if you would, a mugshot of what you're trying to induce an immune response to. So that if you ever really see the intruder, your body would be able to recognize it and attack it, and it already has produced blocking antibodies, and you have T cells ready to respond. But it's really important to think about, well, what does that mugshot look like? If I was arrested and they took a picture of my face, and then I broke out the next day, and I'm just trying to avoid the cops, and I just put on sunglasses, and all you couldn't see was my eyes, you'd probably still be able to recognize me. If I started disguising myself more and more, it may be harder and harder to see me. And what we know now is that the most immunogenic part of this virus is that corona, the spike protein, the thing that is sticking out of the outside of the virus. That is the thing that it uses to attach onto human cells to get in. And that is the thing that is its face. It's the mugshot that our bodies seem to recognize the best. Dr. Hewlett is going to get into speaking about some of the variants that are popping up now. But if you think about it as this virus putting on sunglasses or a wig or something to change its view, you'll see that you're not always going to fool everybody. You can still see who that is, but if you change it enough, you're going to run into problems. Currently, there's only two approved COVID vaccines, and they're approved under what's called the emergency use authorization. The emergency use authorization is not new. That was put in place years ago in preparation for something, for issues like this, where you have to rapidly, in the face of a public health emergency, deploy new treatments or vaccines, even equipment. And the only two approved vaccines are messenger RNA vaccines. I'm going to spend my time really focusing on those, but Dr. Hewlett's going to get into some of the things that are coming down the pike, so you don't have to be re-educated every time there's a new emergency use authorization, because all these vaccines work in very different ways. So both the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines are messenger RNA vaccines. And people said this is a new technology. It's not really that new, to be honest. The company BioNTech had been working with messenger RNA vaccines and trying them against multiple other diseases, Zika, Ebola. And so this technology has been around for quite a while. Messenger RNA is basically the instruction for how to make a protein. So the way it works naturally is that you have DNA, which is the major recipe book of your body, and the DNA is kept in the nucleus of a cell. It then gets transcribed into what's called messenger RNA. That protein goes outside the nucleus, and that gets translated into proteins. So messenger RNA does all its work outside the nucleus in the cytoplasm of a cell. Well, this process just takes a little piece of RNA with the message on how to make the spike protein, put it inside of what's called a nanoparticle, and that's what's being injected in your arm. When that nanoparticle fuses with a cell, it then lets the messenger RNA out into the cytoplasm. It never goes into the nucleus. A lot of people have questioned, well, will this change my genetic code? I had seen somewhat outlandish claims that this was going to change your DNA. Messenger RNA doesn't go backwards. It only comes from the nucleus into the cytoplasm. This goes into the cytoplasm, gets translated. You make the spike protein, and it does what it normally does. It migrates to the surface of the cell, and it starts telling your immune system, I'm foreign. And you now are able to elicit an immune response against it in the form of blocking antibodies, and even a less understood cell-mediated response with T cells. So let's talk about these two trials. This was as of November 30th, 2020. Both Pfizer and BioNTech got together, and Moderna worked with our National Institutes of Health. And these are really large clinical trials. Pfizer was about 43,000, almost 44 enrolled, Moderna about 30,000, multiple sites within the US. One of the things I think is important, as a physician, I'm sure Dr. Hewlett can tell you this as well, it's frustrating how often new drugs come out, new treatments come out, and when you look at the racial ethnic distribution on this trial that they did for registration with the FDA, you often find much lower representation for Blacks and Hispanics than what we see in the country. And yet these drugs get approved. What I'm really glad to see is with these two, I think because they were being developed at a time where there was heightened awareness of ethnic disparities in this disease, you see pretty close to national representation on both trials. 13% Hispanic on Pfizer, 10% African American, 6% Asian, 1% Native American. You see the numbers similar on Moderna, even higher Hispanic representation. And they tried to get people of all ages. I could say the trial for Pfizer went down to 16 years of age to 18, and Moderna started 18 and older. So what did they see? This is what's called a randomized placebo-controlled trial. You're giving a shot of vaccine to one person, a shot of placebo to the next person. In Pfizer's case, they were 21 days apart. In Moderna's case, they're 28 days apart. And they did it 1-to-1. And then they just sent people out into the world. One of the reasons why, unfortunately, this got done so quickly is that COVID-19 was so rampant in the United States while they were running these trials that people got infected pretty quickly. But what the end point of what they were counting was how many people got symptomatic COVID-19 not a SARS-2, the SARS-CoV-2 infection, but symptomatic COVID-19 disease. How many got mild disease? How many got moderate disease? How many people got severe disease? And what they showed was in both cases, if you got vaccinated, you had very little chance of ever getting a symptomatic COVID infection. In the case of Pfizer, there was 95% protection. There were 170 cases of COVID in the whole study, but 162 of them were in the people who got placebo and only 8 in the vaccine group. Moderna was 28 days apart, again, 18 years of age and older. They showed very similar efficacy, 94.5% protection. They had 95 cases of COVID in that study population, 90 in the placebo group, and only 5 in the vaccine group. And that's how you calculate this efficacy. What I've heard is that most people are not worried about misrepresentation of the efficacy. They're concerned about the safety. I should say that both vaccines I mentioned were tested in tens of thousands in the US. It is in a representative sample. I would say slightly lower for African Americans, but 10% at least in both groups. And other than local reactions, which I'll get into, they saw very few significant safety concerns. They saw no significant safety concerns, I should say. They saw very few severe reactions or severe side effects from this. Now, the average follow-up time was only 8 weeks on both trials. And many people have said to me, well, that is a short amount of time to follow somebody. And relatively it is, but what I think you have to look back and see is that what's the likelihood of getting a side effect from a vaccine from all of our prior vaccine experience, which is including, MMR, Tdap, influenza, shingles, HPV. It is rare to see a side effect outside the 8-week time period. So I'm going to get into some of the local side effects, but allergic reactions has also been brought up as a concern because some people may be allergic to this. And a severe form of allergic reaction is called anaphylaxis, could be life-threatening. And there's any site that's doing vaccinations, they are given guidance by the CDC of how to be set up to be ready if somebody has an anaphylactic reaction. But out of 2 million vaccinations that have happened in this country, there have only been 21 cases of reported anaphylaxis. So I think you have to keep this in perspective as well. The chance of an anaphylactic reaction is very, very low. I already mentioned these do not affect DNA in any way. Messenger RNA never goes into the vault of your cell, the nucleus. And you can't get COVID-19 from this because there's no coronavirus in the vaccine. It's just telling your body how to make the one thing that your body will recognize, the spike protein. The rest of the virus is not there. Some of the safety information on reactions within 7 days. This is with about 8,100 patients. You see that injection site pain is common. It's 78% after the second dose got it in a pain in the arm. And if you're less than 55, if you're over 55, it's slightly lower. It's one of the benefits of being older. When you look at the systemic side effects, fatigue, headache, fever, they were more common after the second dose of the vaccine. But for example, with fever, it was very rare to see somebody with a high fever. It was somebody having a 38.2, 38.6 type fever. That is, I should say 100.1 maybe, is not uncommon, but it would be really rare to see somebody with a 102, for example. So a lot of people have expressed concern because the vaccine was developed, they say, too quickly. This slide shows you a normal vaccination timeframe. I will tell you that a lot of the time that it takes to develop a vaccine, when they say it takes 15, 20 years, is figuring out what's the part of that virus that elicits the immune response that's the strongest. That was already known from past experience with SARS and MERS. Everybody knew that it was the spike protein. So that was already known. And normally, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 of a study, looking at safety, efficacy, and then a randomized trial, they're done in tandem. And most companies are not going to put a lot of money into building facilities to make these medications until they're sure it's going to be approved, because they're taking a huge financial risk. What happened with this virus, this vaccine formation, was that a lot of the preclinical work was already there. the messenger RNA vaccines can be considered what we call plug and play technology. Once you've got the genetic sequence of what you're trying to elicit immune response to, the platform was already there. BioNTech had all that done already. And the code to the novel coronavirus was released by Chinese researchers in January. So the world had it almost from the beginning of the Wuhan experience. Then they overlap phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. You could start phase 2 while you're still doing phase 1. And the FDA allowed them to give them the data on a rolling basis that normally you have to finish all 3 and then you give it to them. And what Operation Warp Speed did was that taxpayer dollars went to 6 companies to either help them do their studies or help them ramp up production capability. So the ways that the drug would be made, the money was already flowing for those things to happen. And that's why this went so much faster. It wasn't cutting corners on safety. It was overlapping phases of the study and removing a lot of the barriers that we normally have in drug development. I believe Brother Tompkins said, people are suspicious because they wonder, well, who made this vaccine? Where did this come from? And you may not recognize these women, but they're superstars as far as I'm concerned. Judith Absalom is a senior medical director of vaccine research with Pfizer. She was one of the clinical leads that went to designing and carrying out the clinical end of the Pfizer trial. Kizzy Corbett works in the NIH, and I mentioned Moderna worked with the NIH in carrying out the Moderna trial. She was on the basic science side. She was very instrumental in the team that developed the Moderna vaccine. So this wasn't a case of a secret group coming out with these vaccines. We had members of our community who were playing major roles in the development and of these vaccines. I just want to quickly mention there is safety monitoring going on even after the emergency use authorization. Anybody who gets vaccinated, look this up, vSafe. It's a handheld, it goes right to your smartphone. It's put out by the CDC. If you have any side effects from the vaccine, you can give the information directly to the CDC through this handheld program. I just want to finish off my portion by saying that I am not in no way judgmental about folks having hesitancy about vaccination. And people often bring up the Tuskegee experiment, and I wish that was the only example of times when we as a people were experimented on in the name of progress, and it's not, unfortunately. But I think there's a lot of people who don't understand what happened during Tuskegee. Tuskegee, that experiment happened through most of the 20th century, starting in the 1930s. It was a natural history study. They wanted to see what happens if you have syphilis for a long time. How long does it take until it gets into your brain and causes neurosyphilis and things like that? The horror of Tuskegee was not that they gave people syphilis. It was that during the course of that study, cures for syphilis came out. And the government did not want these men to get the cure because the whole study was supposed to be a longitudinal observation to see what happens over time. So if they started treating them, the whole study would have been a wash. And it should have been a wash. The ethical thing would have been to do that. So I just want to say that the Tuskegee experiment, I think, does inform what's happening to us today. But it was the withholding of effective treatments that made Tuskegee a horror, not giving somebody an infection. And what I'm concerned is that here in 2020, our vaccine hesitancy may have us do to ourselves what the government did to us in Tuskegee. So I just want to end with this statement by Martin Luther King Jr., where out of all the forms of inequality that man saw, he thought injustice in health was the most shocking and the most inhumane because it often results in physical death. And so our goal here is to offer you guys balanced and transparent information in a situation that has become politicized and made more confusing than it should. And I'm very proud to see efforts like this, and lots of my colleagues are out in the faith-based communities and Black Greek organizations, and I'm just really proud of the community to see after we organize politically, after we're organizing again in this front. And again, I would just want to say thank you to the Orange and Morristown Alumni chapter for giving us this opportunity to do it. I'm going to stop sharing here. Brother Bolden, I think you're muted.
Forgive me, everybody. I just wanted to say thank you for that very excellent presentation. A lot of tidbits there. There are a few takeaways for me. Wow, the two lead designers of the vaccine were both Black women. Both vaccines have roughly a 95% efficacy. There is no coronavirus in the vaccine. And there were significant numbers of representatives of people of color active participating in the clinical trials. Very good to hear.
Yes.
Very good to hear. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Well, we do have some questions that came in for you, and I have them in front of me now, and I'd like to pose them at this moment, if that's okay.
Sure.
First question is, does the vaccine prevent virus infection, or does it just reduce the risk of developing symptoms of the COVID-19 disease?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because I think that's an answer that we need desperately, because I think a lot of people look for vaccination as our fast way to get back to hanging out at the inkwell, or getting back together with family at Thanksgiving, and we don't know yet. Because the endpoints of the study were studying the incidence of symptomatic COVID infections, not the viral infection. The reassuring thing is lots of vaccines do prevent transmission, asymptomatic transmission. You look at something like HPV vaccination, that does stop people from getting the virus in the first place. But until we have that information from these vaccines, we can't say that that's going to be the case. But we can get that information from the studies that are ongoing. Some of the studies are looking at antibody responses to see how often some of the people who never had a symptom might have gotten COVID in the past. So unfortunately, we need to reach herd immunity and stop the ability for this virus to jump around. But when is it going to change our newfound mitigation strategies of wearing masks and social distancing? I'm not quite sure. I think for now, I've done both I got Moderna by chance. That's just what was going around the day I showed up at my hospital. But I can't stop wearing a mask, and I can't just quickly go see my mother because I've got both doses of the vaccine.
Okay. So just because you have the vaccine, you've actually gotten both doses of the vaccine, doesn't mean that you can go to a sporting event and not have to wear a mask.
I can say, going off the Moderna vaccine trials, I feel pretty good about my level of protection. Mm-hmm. That I'm very unlikely to have a significant COVID-19 infection, but I can't say that I could not cause that in one of my neighbors or friends.
I see. Okay. All right, thank you. Our next question. If you already contracted the virus and recovered, do you still need the vaccine?
Yeah, it's recommended, even if you got COVID-19, you should still get vaccinated. And I'll tell you the reason why. Natural immunity can wane over time. And so because you got COVID, it doesn't mean, I'll be honest, that it's rare to get COVID twice within 90 days. That much we do know, that it seems natural immunity tends to hang around at least 90 days, but we don't know how much longer it hangs around after that. And so if you've had COVID, you should get vaccinated. There are a couple of situations that I should make you aware of. You should be careful. If you happen to receive monoclonal antibodies during your treatment, you should wait 90 days before you get vaccinated. And that's just because the vaccine is going to produce a lot of antibodies in your body. And we don't know how getting passively immunized with an infusion of somebody else's antibodies or taking one of the commercially available antibodies, and then you make your own on top of it, what that might do. But otherwise, yeah, you should still get vaccinated.
Gotcha. And our next question, you may have already answered with that response. The question is, how long will the immunity last?
Again, that's a $1 million question. And we don't know how long the safety lasts. And the studies did not have long-term follow-up. But I'll tell you, the difficulty for a lot of vaccine trials, and Dr. Hewlett is an infectious disease specialist, not me, so I'm sure he can speak to this more than I can. We look for what's called a correlate of protection. Like if we knew that there was a certain antibody level that you could check in somebody's blood, and if they dip below that number, it's time to give them a booster. You could then figure out how often you need to check people's blood and when they need to come in for a booster. But with other situations I've seen where you can have antibody levels drop back down to pre-vaccination levels, and yet the person still doesn't develop the disease. So the only way you can find out how long the protection lasts is to keep following people who got vaccinated the earliest. And so those two trials that went on to get the emergency use authorization are going to continue following those participants for 2 years. So they're not off the trial when the trial ended. They're still being followed. And you're going to have post-approval surveillance of the millions of Americans who are going to get vaccinated to see when does this seem to wear off.
So I actually got my first dosage earlier this week, and I've been actually getting emails or texts from the VSafe app that you described earlier. So that means well after the second dose, I'll still be getting those texts.
You will, and you'll have the ability, if anything happens, then you're questioning if this could be related. I mean, if you develop a rash months ago now and you're not sure, you can always independently just offer that information.
Gotcha.
I'm not going to cover variants because I know Dr. Hewlett's going to get into that, but I think a lot of people have questions about what will happen if there's a surge of a different variant that has different, less coverage. But I think he'll be able to cover that completely in his part.
All right. A couple of more questions here. Very good questions, by the way. Thank you, audience. Next question is, if the vaccine requires 2 shots, when does it begin to become effective? In other words, can you become infected between shots?
Yeah, I have to tell you, in between my 2 shots, I was wondering that myself. I was walking around going, I'm wondering, how close am I getting to that 90? Because I'm working in a hospital every day and I'm thinking, did I get enough? The studies started looking after the second dose, 2 weeks after the second dose, they started collecting cases. And so, but they did look at the difference between what happened between the first and second dose. And for Pfizer, they showed there was about 50% protection, even after 1 dose. And I believe and it was even higher for Moderna. So there's some protection you're going to get from the first dose, but you really should get that second dose on time.
Gotcha. Excellent. Okay, last question we have here, maybe an area that Dr. Hewlett will get into later too. The question is, if the virus mutates, will these vaccines remain effective?
Yeah, and again, I will defer to Dr. Hewlett to cover this. I just want to go back to the analogy of a mugshot.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to say that when they give you some of the DNA to make a spike protein, they don't just give you one little snapshot of the spike protein. They actually include multiple parts of the spike protein for you to be able to put together a picture of what it looks like. And so I'd have to say one mutation alone is not going to be enough to throw a vaccine off. The question becomes, can you accumulate enough to change the mugshot enough to fool your body? So I think it's an unknown question, and he'll get into it more, but it remains to be seen.
Understood. All right. Well,
thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you. Excellent presentation. Thank you, Brother Holcomb. All right. Well, let's keep it moving. Our next speaker, Dr. Dial Hewlett, MD, is an infectious disease expert and has over 45 years of experience in the medical field. He currently serves as the Director of Disease Control and Deputy to the Commissioner at Westchester County's Department of Health. He is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin, as well as the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine. Finally, he is a proud 1968 initiate of Ka Psi's Beta Omicron chapter. Without further ado, I give you Dr. Dial Hewlett. Dr. Hewlett? You're on mute, Dr. Hewlett.
Thank you, Brother Todd, and thank you to all of the esteemed members of the Orange and Morristown chapter of Kappa Alpha Psi, Brother Weber, Brother Tompkins, Brother Bolden.
Brother Hewlett, I let Brother Holcomb get away with that. I got to get you. That's Maplewood-Oranges.
Okay, okay. I'm so sorry, but
Excuse me.
I'm honored to be here, and I do want to I do want to again express my gratitude as Dr. Holcomb did. I think that it's very important for us to provide this community service every time that we have the opportunity to do something that is going to improve the health of our community. Count me in. I'm happy to do it. And I have had the privilege to serve as a member of the National Medical Association Task Force. And one of the things that we have been trying to do with that task force is to build trust, to be trusted messengers, to take some of this medical and scientific information and to interpret it and to try to share it with our community so that you can make educated decisions for yourselves, as well as for your family and for your colleagues and other members of your community. And I've also had the privilege of being able to work with a group of infectious disease specialists of color. We have a group known as the Interest Group of the Infectious Disease Society of America. There are over 25 members of that group. Dr. Judith Absalon, whose picture you showed, she's actually one of the members of our group. And we have had the opportunity to interface with the Biden-Harris task force on COVID. And we hope in the future that people will call upon members of our group whenever we can help in terms of being credible sources of information for you. So without further ado, I will attempt now to share my screen. And first I'm going to pull up my slides here. And put the share screen on. And let's see where we are here. Let me find my slides again. Okay, can everyone see my slides now? Nope.
We can. Brother Hugh, you might want to go into the slideshow format so it's larger.
Let's see if I can.
Right there, right along top.
Boy, let's see if I can transition to.
Just keep going to the right, to the slideshow.
For some reason I can't get this little thing off of here. Seems to be hidden here. Let's see if I can. Okay, I got it here. Slideshow. Okay. You can teach the old dog new tricks here. So, okay, so we're going to give an overview, and I'm going to try to avoid any redundancy and go over some of the things that that Dr. Holcomb may not have covered. First, let me take this off here. Okay. First of all, just going way back, vaccines, where would we be without them? This is a picture of Dr. William Jenner. He was a famous physician back in the 1700s, and he was actually the first person to develop vaccines. It's been stated or speculated that Dr. Jenner might actually have done more in terms of the health of mankind than any other single person up until that point, because he was the person who developed the smallpox vaccine. See if I can move to the next slide. Okay. And so in his day, smallpox was a major killer. And in fact, in some areas, smallpox killed 10% of the population, with numbers as high as 20% in certain towns and cities where infection spread more easily. And so if you think about that, that was the kind of thing that he was facing then, and we're facing a similar situation right now. Now, the terms vaccine and vaccination are actually derived from the term variola or vaccinia, which was smallpox of the cow. One of the things that Dr. Jenner noticed was that when there were outbreaks of smallpox in the various communities, the people who actually milked cows, they called them the milkmaids, they never developed smallpox. And what he found was that these individuals were coming in contact with a virus. At that time, they didn't know it was a virus, but it was the agent that caused cowpox. And this was very similar to smallpox. And as a result, the milkmaids were actually protected from getting smallpox. And that was the basis for the vaccine. Now, think about this before we get into the actual COVID vaccine issue. We know that there are some common vaccine preventable diseases, and some of them are listed here, not all of them, but you're familiar with polio, whooping cough, measles, German measles, mumps, chickenpox, even pneumococcal disease and a condition known as Haemophilus influenza. These are all vaccine preventable diseases. I'll give you an example. If we look at this one here called Haemophilus influenza, when I was doing my fellowship at Jacobi Hospital back in the early 1980s, we would see numerous children coming into the hospital with meningitis due to Haemophilus influenza. This was a severely devastating disease because most of the children who would suffer from this would be left with permanent cognitive impairment. When I was in medical school, they told me that, you'll never see a case of the measles. And the reason why you're not going to see a case of the measles is because we've essentially controlled the measles with a vaccine that's extremely effective. Well, when we move forward, what happens when we stop vaccinating? Well, when we stopped vaccinating about 10 years ago, it became very popular not to vaccinate your children. And back in April of just 2 years ago now, more than 285 cases of the measles were reported in New York. And that was in the fall of 2019. All of them were associated with people who lived at that time in Williamsburg or Borough Park neighborhoods of Brooklyn. In 2010 in California, there were over 9,000 cases of the whooping cough and 10 infant deaths occurred. That was the highest rate in over 60 years. Again, it was very popular and it was in vogue at that time not to vaccinate children. Part of it was due to the fact that there was a false narrative that was circulated based on fraudulent research done by a man by the name of Dr. Wakefield that vaccines caused autism. It was later found out, belatedly unfortunately, that this research was based on fraud. Dr. Wakefield went to prison in the UK. However, that part of the story really didn't get out. And by the time this all occurred, a lot of damage had already been done. In Rockland County, New York, there was an outbreak of the mumps. And there were nearly 17,000 doses of vaccine that had to be administered over a 26-week period in order to halt that outbreak. And so this is what happens when we stop vaccinating against infections that we had previously controlled. Now, Dr. Holcomb already talked to you about the mRNA vaccines and that these vaccines contain the messenger RNA and that this stimulates the production of what we call antibodies. And it also stimulates the development of what we call memory T cells. And both of these arms of our immune system will help protect us against COVID. And he already mentioned to you that there are two of these that are out. One is called the Pfizer and the other is the Moderna. And we also know now that there are other platforms. There are two other platforms. There's what we call the viral vector vaccines. One of them, which is in late phase development, is by AstraZeneca, also in conjunction with Oxford University. And the second is from the Janssen Vaccine Development Division of Johnson & Johnson. Now, the viral vector vaccines contain a weakened version of a live virus, and it's a virus that's different than the one that actually causes COVID-19. It has genetic material from the virus that causes COVID-19 that's inserted within this, and it's referred to as a viral vector. The material that is inserted into it is what Dr. Holcomb spoke with you about, and that's the spike protein. Once the viral vector is inside our cells, the genetic material gives cells instructions to make a protein that is unique to the virus, which is the spike protein. And using these instructions, our cells make copies of that protein. And this prompts our bodies to build T lymphocytes or memory cells and B lymphocytes that will essentially produce antibody so that our body will remember how to fight this virus if we do encounter it moving forward. Now, this just happened yesterday. On CNN, it was reported yesterday morning that Johnson & Johnson, the Janssen division of Johnson & Johnson, they reported preliminary results of their phase 3 clinical trials. These phase 3 trials, as Dr. Holcomb pointed out to you, these trials are large trials. They had, in this case, an enrollment that was planned up to 60,000 individuals, and the trial was conducted globally. This is what we call a viral vector vaccine, and so they used an adenovirus vector. And adenoviruses are viruses that are very commonly found, and these are cold viruses essentially. And they found, in the bottom line here, that this vaccine was 85% effective versus severe disease. It was 72% effective versus moderate and severe disease when you combine those two together, and 66% effective overall. Now, some people have said to me over the last day, well, you know, the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, they must be much better because they report 95%. So I don't think that I want to settle for this one. What I think we have to think about here is that when we're talking about 85% efficacy versus severe disease, that's actually extremely good. 95% and 94% efficacy, everyone was pleasantly shocked when those results were reported. When the trials were originally planned, it was felt that if we got 50% efficacy or more, that the programs would move forward. And so everyone was pleasantly surprised when we reported 95%. And keep in mind that this particular vaccine was essentially 100% effective in terms of keeping people out of the hospital and preventing death. Now, for this particular vaccine, Dr. Fauci mentioned on the reports, I believe it was the night before last, that this is going to be a relatively inexpensive type of vaccine. The technology here is not as expensive as the mRNA technology. It's only going to be a single dose. There's no cold chain requirement. And so you may recall hearing that for the Pfizer vaccine, you require extremely low temperatures for storage. That's not the case here. And so this particular product may be more adaptable for use in smaller clinics, in doctors' offices, and also possibly and importantly, in some of the under-resourced parts of the country, such as rural areas, and also isolated parts of the world. So all of the products that are being developed, there's going to be room for all of them. And I think all of them are going to offer distinct advantages for the population. One final advantage might be that during the clinical program, there were no cases of anaphylaxis reported. And some people believe that there's a component in the mRNA vaccines that may make it more likely that people who are predisposed to having anaphylactic reactions following vaccines, that they may be reacting to this component that's called polyethylene glycol. And so for that reason, this particular product may be more useful in people that have that type of history. Now, the protein subunit vaccines, none of them are available yet, but they are on the horizon. And these protein subunit vaccines include harmless pieces of proteins of the spike protein. And essentially, it's the same principle. Once we are infected in the future, there will be memory cells that will recognize and fight the virus as well as antibody. Now, as far as tracking COVID vaccine, as of January the 27th of 2021, there have been over 82.5 million doses administered, 59 countries globally, an average of 3.95 million doses per day are being administered. And so you have a lot of people out there who don't seem to be hesitating, although we don't have as much vaccine as we need. In the US, a total of 25 million doses, an average of 1.21 million doses per day. Across the US, that comes out to 7.8 doses per 100 persons. And 54% of the doses that have been delivered to states have been administered. And so some doses are being reserved for the second doses. Now, there's a lot of talk about virus variants, and let's discuss this so that everyone understands what's happening. Before we even go into that discussion, let's mention the fact that the coronavirus is an RNA virus, and RNA viruses are notorious for mutating. The longer the virus is around and the more people it infects, the more mutations are going to occur. And so we're essentially in a race against this virus, because the quicker we are able to contain it, the less likely we are to see mutations. And so we won't even have to worry about mutations if we're able to get to the point where we achieve herd immunity. But as long as we are lagging behind and we are having infections occur at the rate that they're occurring, then we are going to be worried about these viral variants. The one that is most worrisome right now is what we call the South African variant. And there were 2 cases that were diagnosed in adults just this week in the state of South Carolina. So that's something that's essentially right at our doorstep. And this variant has been identified in at least 30 countries. Now, one of the things we should know, and although we only have 2 cases that we know about, here in the United States, when our administration changed back in 2017, they decided that we didn't really need to invest a lot of money in things like surveillance and testing of viruses and testing for variants. And so a lot of the things that we had been doing previously, we stopped doing. Now, some of the European countries do extensive testing to detect variants. And so that's why they get this information before we do. And so they actually have been very successful in identifying these. And so chances are there are a lot more variants here in the United States than we realize. There's a UK variant, and there have been at least 315 cases in the United States that have been identified from 28 different states. There's also a Brazil variant, and a case was identified in a traveler who was returning to their home in Minnesota from South America. The South African and the Brazil variants may be less susceptible to antibody. And one of the things that is troubling about this is that if they're less susceptible to antibody, they may at some point be less and less susceptible to the vaccination. And so that's something that we're still looking at. It is rather ominous that the 2 main manufacturers, both Pfizer and Moderna, are looking at this. They're looking at these strains. They're doing lots of testing, and they're in the process of developing what may be used as boosters in the event that the vaccines become less effective than they had been previously. So let's talk about a few of the myths, and I'll conclude my talk by going through a few myths. And this kind of shows my age. There was a program that was on many, many years ago called Dragnet. And this is Sergeant Joe Friday. And Sergeant Joe Friday, his favorite line was just the facts, just the facts. And so let's try to dispel the myths, and let's try to talk about some of the facts here. So let's dispel the myths. Fact number 1 is that the US has 4% of the world's population, yet 25% of the COVID cases and 20% of the COVID deaths. Fact, as of last week, we had 4,000 people per day who were dying from COVID. That's a fact. Fact, new variant strains are more easily transmissible and they may actually give rise to future surges. You heard what Dr. Fauci has been saying over the last few days. That's one of the big concerns that everyone has. It's a fact that COVID can cause serious disease in our infants and in our children. And it's a fact right now that the current vaccine is not indicated for use in children. We don't have data to support use in children under the age of 16 for the Pfizer product and under the age of 18 for the Moderna product. And so guess what that means to us? What it means to us is that we as the adults have to take responsibility for making sure that we are protecting ourselves, because if we don't protect ourselves, then we are definitely going to, in the long run, cause problems for our infants and children. Now, we don't know for sure that the vaccines are going to prevent infection that might still place us at risk for passing the disease on to others. And that's why we're still wearing the mask, and that's why we're still distancing and avoiding gatherings. But our hope is, as Dr. Holcomb mentioned, that we will be preventing infection. And so we're going to be relying on herd immunity to protect our infants and our children until we have the vaccine approved for use in infants and children. Now, it's a fact that the rates of infection and death are significantly higher among African Americans and the Latinx community. If we're an African American, we are 3.7 times more likely to be hospitalized than the majority population. If we are African American, we are 2.8 times more likely to die as a result of this infection. And the rate of infection in our communities, in our African American communities overall for the whole country, is 69 per 100,000. And for the majority community, it's 23 per 100,000. It's a fact that despite stringent precautions, COVID can spread rapidly in our assisted living and long-term care facilities and congregate settings. So the places where our parents and grandparents may be, and other people who are debilitated or disabled, they were hardest hit by this outbreak. And so we're worried about them. And certainly that's why the vaccine is important there. And it's also a fact that unless we reach herd immunity, which is probably now between 70 and 80%, this pandemic is going to continue. So myth number one, we can't trust COVID-19 because the development was rushed. Well, Dr. Holcomb already mentioned that. Work on this virus began back in 2003. We knew the genomic sequence in January of last year. And so there was a full FDA review. The task force for the National Medical Association actually got an in-person review by Dr. Hahn, who is the commissioner of the FDA. And he felt that it was important for him to take time out of his day to talk to the National Medical Association task force, because he knew that people in our community were going to be hesitant about taking this vaccine. So the commissioner of the FDA, he wanted to make sure that we were convinced that they didn't take any shortcuts. And so there were also four full reviews that were conducted by the task forces of the CDC, as well as the task forces of some of the individual states, including New York State, California. Myth number two, the vaccine will give me COVID. Well, we already had mentioned that the vaccines do not contain the live coronavirus. There is no risk of causing disease in a vaccinated person. The mRNA vaccines contain a harmless piece of spike protein, and this spike protein is found on the surface of the coronavirus. Myth number three, we don't know what's in these vaccines. Well, the content of these vaccines is clearly stated. This standard labeling is required by the FDA and by other regulatory agencies. And one of our colleagues on one of the meetings where this question was asked by one of his patients, he said to the patient, he said, well, you know, sir, I've been prescribing Viagra for you for the last 10 years, and you never asked me what was in the Viagra. Myth number four, these vaccines will alter my DNA. The messenger RNA in the COVID vaccines is rapidly cleared. Messenger RNA is not the same as DNA. The mRNA from the vaccine cannot combine with the DNA in our body or change the genetic codes. Myth number 5, which was already essentially addressed in one of the questions earlier, but maybe we can elaborate on this. I already had COVID-19, so I won't benefit from this vaccine. Well, this is false. The COVID vaccines are recommended for persons who have previously recovered. It is recommended that ideally individuals who have had COVID should wait for about 90 days after recovery before they take the vaccine. And that's because their natural immunity will probably last, as was said earlier, for at least 90 days. And so then that's probably the ideal time to take one of the vaccines. The measured immune responses in the studies following vaccine have been shown to be up to 4 times the response that is seen following a natural infection. Myth number 6, since COVID-19 survival rate is so high, and the survival rate is 98%, 2% death rate, that means 98% recover or don't die. Because this survival rate is so high, I don't really need a vaccine. This is, again, false. Although the survival rate from COVID-19 is 98%, between 10% and 40%, depending upon our age, of the impacted persons develop long-term symptomatology. And the term that we've used for that is called the long haulers. Long-term complications can be very debilitating. I have spoken to a number of people who we've been working with at our health department, who have worked in areas like public safety, police officers, firefighters, and other people. And they have been challenged because they now have shortness of breath when they were able to climb the ladders to fight fires and to do all of the other things that they were required to do on a day-to-day basis, and now they can no longer do that. Some of the complications include things like coagulation or clotting disorders. This can place people at higher risk for heart attacks and myocardial infarction, strokes or cerebral vascular accidents, as we call it, and even neurologic disorders, including loss of taste and loss of smell and chronic fatigue. There's also been a syndrome known as brain fog, where people who have recovered and they try to go back to their regular occupations that might require a high level of concentration. They find that they're no longer able to do that. And so it's important for us to think of this not only as a survival, but also the possibility that a person can be disabled for a long-term period of time or even permanently. And recently, erectile dysfunction was also reported as a known complication of COVID. Myth number 7, the COVID vaccines cause sterility. This is also false. And Dr. Holcomb, of course, knows a bit more about this than I do in his field, but this myth was perpetuated on the internet. It was claimed that the vaccine spike protein cross-reacts with another protein known as syncytin 1, and that this is an important protein for placental formation. The vaccines do not contain this protein, nor does the mRNA that is encoding for syncytin 1. These vaccine spike proteins and the syncytin are very different from each other, and there is absolutely no evidence that the vaccine response creates cross-reacting antibodies to syncytin. Myth number 8. Now that we have vaccines, the pandemic will be over soon. And once vaccinated, we no longer require masks. Well, we already said, to date, we have data supporting the fact that the vaccines prevent serious disease and hospitalization, but we don't have information that definitively show that the vaccines prevent asymptomatic infection. So we must continue to wear our masks, our face coverings, and we must continue to distance and avoid gatherings until we reach herd immunity. Herd immunity may require up to 80% or higher. Now, what we are hoping is that data from some of the studies that are being conducted, that we will get data that will show that we are able to prevent actual and asymptomatic infection. Now, this is not a myth. Florida residents lined up overnight to get the COVID-19 vaccine. So maybe they know something that we don't know, or maybe we know something that they don't know. There were long lines in Brooklyn just last week as hundreds gathered in the Bushwick campus on Irving Place. Lines were long Thursday at the Forum in Inglewood, California, one of 5 Los Angeles County COVID-19 vaccinations. So maybe they don't know something that we know, or maybe we know something that they don't know. The vaccine phone line went up in New Jersey on Monday morning with 250 agents ready to answer calls, and so far their response has been overwhelming. So a lot of people want this vaccine. And finally, the rich and powerful are actually trying to skip to the front of the line to get their COVID-19 vaccine. Hollywood elites are going to great lengths to get the shots. This is not a myth. So I'll close at this point and I will stop sharing. Thank you very much for allowing me to lead this discussion with you. And I will turn things back over to Brother Todd, our moderator.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Hewlett. I was wondering what happened to your pretty new face there. All right.
Push the wrong button there.
That's okay. That's okay. So the way the story goes, when the doctor was prescribing Viagra, there was no questions about the ingredients, but with the vaccine, he wants to know everything about. That's real talk. Wow.
That's correct. That was from Dr. Rodney Hood, who
Wow.
was the past president of the National Medical Association. He practices out in San Diego, California.
Wow. Wow. Well, that was an excellent presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Hewlett. Some of the takeaways that jumped out at me, unless we reach herd immunity, 70 to 80% of the pandemic will continue. There could be more variants in the United States than we realize because we weren't testing for variants as much as some other countries. And we won't have to worry about variants as much if we achieve herd immunity.
That's correct.
One question that came in, which I think is a very good question, is we hear the term herd immunity all the time, but can you just give us a just basic textbook definition of what actually herd immunity is?
Sure, I can try. Herd immunity is based upon calculations where you determine the infectiousness of a particular infection, or let's just say, for example, with measles. I think with measles, for every one case, you might have maybe, I want to say, let's just say arbitrarily, at least 5 other people will get the infection from one case. And so there's a index that is calculated to figure out, in order to prevent all of the cases from measles to occurring, and they call this the RO, in order to prevent measles from occurring anymore, you have to reach a herd immunity rate of 92%, meaning that if you fall below that 92%, you're going to start to see measles cases again. And that is how they can determine, and that's what they've observed with various infections. And so the percentage, it's essentially the percentage of people in the population that have to be immunized. That essentially is what we mean by herd immunity. So initially it was thought that for COVID, we would have to reach about 60%. With these new variants, the experts have told us that because these new variants are more infectious and we have more cases developing from every single case, that they've recalculated and they're now estimating that it's up around 80%. But that's actually what we mean by herd immunity.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. It's just a term that we hear doctors throw around all the time, and everybody assumes they know what it is, but I appreciate the question from the attendee. Yes.
And I'll mention one other thing too, conceptually. With some infections like that require the use of actual viruses, attenuated viruses as we call it. Some children, for example, cannot take those vaccines because of their underlying disease like leukemia. They've had transplants and things like that. So you can't immunize those children. So those children rely on what we call herd immunity. That is, everybody else has been immunized. So if you have a school with 1,000 children and you have one child who has leukemia, that child is protected because all of the other children in the school have been immunized, even though that child wasn't able to take the shot. So it's kind of like that kind of a concept.
Understood. Thank you. Thank you. We have some more questions regarding your presentation. The first one is as follows. Is it true that some people can experience long-term effects related to COVID? How serious are these potentially, and can these complications be easily treated?
Yes, unfortunately, when we were talking about the long haulers, these are people that by definition have symptoms that go on for several weeks or even months. And in some cases, we have been told at our health department, we've been told about people who were infected back in April and May, and they still are debilitated. And some of these symptoms, as we mentioned, are things like chronic shortness of breath and a decrease in exercise tolerance because there's scarring of the lungs. Some people have had problems with their memory because there may have been what we call almost like mini strokes that have occurred. These things can be treated. Certainly people that continue to have symptoms after they have should have recovered from COVID, they should be working with their physician and they should speak with their physician about this. There are actually registries that are being opened up. Dr. Fauci and the National Institutes of Health, they've actually created a national registry to try to follow people. Because if you think about this, this is one of the big issues that has not really been well discussed. This disease has been causing all of these deaths, and it's horrible that we have these 437,000 people in the United States who died. But we also have under the surface all of these people who may be debilitated and disabled. And so we really don't even know what the impact that is going to have. Think about the impact that this is going to have on the families. It's terrible when we lose a family member, but it's also going to be terrible when the breadwinner of the family can no longer work because they're disabled. So the answer is yes, some of these things can be treated. For the blood clotting disorder, sometimes people have to be placed on blood thinners. Sometimes people that have had inflammatory disease that has damaged their lungs, they can actually receive anti-inflammatory medication. They're going to be also rehabilitation sometimes people have to go through. So I think the bottom line is many of these things will be treatable, but we have to make sure that people seek medical attention from their physicians so that they will avail themselves.
Thank you. All right, this next question, somebody put a lot of thought into this. The previous administration was not known for transparency, and we all know that the FDA and CDC are overseen by the White House. What is the basis for your confidence in the process by which the vaccines were developed and approved, given those realities?
Yes, that's a question that is very important. And as I mentioned during my talk, you do have some people who are career scientists who remained with those institutions. Fortunately, you have people like Dr. Hahn at the FDA, who really is devoted to transparency and who actually was being threatened by the previous administration that he might be fired if he didn't follow some of their recommendations. As far as the CDC was concerned, we did have a lot of questions about the CDC, but again, fortunately, we had some career scientists who stood by and they tried their best to make sure that there was transparency. I think the other part that Brother Holcomb actually brought out was the fact that if you look at the manufacturers, although companies are certainly their businesses and they're trying to make profit, but if we look at the scientists who were there, those two brilliant African-American women who were there, you had a lot of people working for these companies who really are thinking first and foremost about things that are going to be in the best interest of the society. And so even though they're working for a company, they are worried primarily about making sure that what they're doing is going to help the society.
Brother Hewlett, can I make one point, add to that? I thought it was interesting, Operation Warp Speed, which I felt was a horrible name for it. Could have been predictable. It would lead to mistrust with that name. They gave 6 companies assistance with the development of vaccines. It's interesting that the one who won the race, Pfizer and BioNTech, didn't take $1 from the Trump administration for the development of their vaccine, and they got to market first. The only money they took from the Trump administration had to do with help with distribution and production. And so it's interesting. And if you remember when President Trump had a gathering in the White House to gather all the companies together to have a photo op with everyone, Pfizer refused to show up. And when he wanted release of preliminary data on the vaccines before the election, because there might have been a benefit to him for that. If you remember, they would not release the information. He was livid about those things. So if you were following the stories, it was the FDA pushing against President Trump. He was unable to get them to do what he had hoped to get them to do.
Right, I agree. And the other piece that you had alluded to during your presentation was that Moderna was closely partnered with the National Institutes of Health. And so the National Institutes of Health, they actually conducted a lot of the basic science research, and they helped to design the trials. And Moderna was essentially at the other end in terms of the, I guess you'd say the commercial or business end of it. So you had Dr. Fauci and the National Institutes of Health, who of course, I think everybody views as credible partners.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Holcomb, for bringing that up. Okay, we're just coming up on 90 minutes and we still have to get to general Q&A, but I have a couple more here for you, Dr. Hewlett. If a person is immunocompromised as a result of cancer or HIV, is it worthwhile for them to receive the vaccine?
Yes, it certainly is. And that's a great question. Individuals who are immunocompromised, we believe many of them are at a much higher risk for having serious disease and even death. And although they will not necessarily have the same robust response to the vaccine that an otherwise normal person will have, they still will be protected. And we hope that that would certainly mean that they would be less likely to develop severe illness. So they should be encouraged to take the vaccine.
So they wouldn't have the same robust response, but there will be significant mitigation gained.
Yes.
Okay, got it. All right, next question for you, Dr. Hewlett, would be, how should we advise women who are pregnant and work in hospitals, nursing homes, or other high-risk settings for exposure to COVID?
Yeah, I want to definitely partner with Dr. Holcomb on this. This is a very, very important issue. And the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology has taken a position on this, and they have said that they feel that it is reasonable for women who are pregnant, who are going to be in these high-risk situations. For example, if a woman is working in a critical care unit or in a hospital or clinic or other type situation where they're going to be at high risk for infection, that in conjunction with discussions with their doctor, they should be allowed to have the vaccine. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Holcomb because I know he's closer to this than I am.
No, it's exactly as you stated. I would just go to say further. American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology actually pushed to get pregnant women on the trials. And for those who feel like safety standards were reduced, here was a professional organization asking to have this at-risk group included on the trials, and the FDA said no. And that was because you have to have extensive animal model studies done on reproduction. They call DART studies, development and reproductive toxicity studies. And those studies didn't get completed for both Moderna and Pfizer until after they started their trials. And so pregnant women were not included on those trials. But as Dr. Hewlett stated, ACOG, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, strongly recommends if a woman wants to be vaccinated, that there's no biologic plausibility to that being dangerous for her. I would also like to mention that pregnancy is a high-risk factor. The CDC names pregnancy as a high risk factor for COVID infections because now there's multiple reports showing that pregnant women are at higher risk for intubation and death, ICU admission. And so, the trials on women now have started. So we will get this information. But, the question is, what happens if your number gets called now and you're pregnant? Should you be vaccinated? And I would argue, yes, you should.
I would agree.
Very good. Very good. All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hewlett. That was an excellent presentation, of course. Yes, excellent, excellent. And we have a very engaged audience, which we really appreciate. We have some really good questions coming in. So I guess what we should do now is just move over to general Q&A, where we can address these questions. And I don't have any question directed specifically to either one of you. So if either one of you want to chime in when the question is actually raised, by all means. The first question is with our general Q&A. With the Pfizer vaccine, it requires extremely cold conditions during storage. What controls and monitoring are in place to confirm those vaccines were not compromised? Like what happened with the pharmacists in Milwaukee who purposefully tampered with vaccines by leaving them out all night?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And the response to that is that the cold chain requirements, there is monitoring that is done. So it's generally not under the control of any single person. And you can actually tell, and again, I don't know all of the technology behind this, but you can actually, there are actually ways in which the maintenance of the temperature is actually traced to actually assure that there hasn't been a break in what we call this cold chain. One of the things that was installed in our health department, this again is just what's happening in our health department, but I think it helps, it happens in other health departments as well. The place where the vaccine is stored, where the freezers are located, there's a camera and it operates on facial recognition. There are only 3 people in our health department who can go into that area, and that camera will, if there's a failure of face recognition, the police department is called. So I can't even go there. It's only our pharmacists as well as our supervisory nurse. Anybody else goes there, the police department actually comes. And so this was put in as a safeguard to try to make sure that you can see everyone who's going in and out of the area where the vaccine is being stored. So you know exactly what is happening.
I see. Very good. Doctor?
I also didn't recognize how long you can actually keep both the messenger RNA vaccines outside of that cold storage. I remember when I went for my first dose, I was curious to see how my hospital was going to have this really deep freezer right next to where it was going to go in my arm. And when I didn't see that, I got a little nervous and I said, well, how long has that been sitting there? They just took it out of a regular refrigerator. But it turns out that the messenger RNA is unstable and you have to keep it very cold, but it can stay out of that level of cold storage for over 24 hours. I think it's up to like 30 hours. It can be in a regular refrigerator.
Correct.
I see. All right, very good, very good. The next question is, if someone participated in a vaccine trial study, should they wait because they don't know if the COVID-19 vaccine was received during the study or if it was the placebo?
I can address that. I think that what has happened is that anyone that received placebo is, because of the efficacy that was noted, it was felt from an ethical standpoint that individuals who received placebo during the study, that they should be offered the live vaccine. So when the study results were unblinded and you were able to tell who got placebo versus who got the real vaccine, there was an obligation to offer the vaccine to everyone. So then it would be up to that individual if they wanted the real vaccine or not. They certainly were entitled to receive it.
Gotcha. Okay, all right. Next question would be, does the vaccine have MRC5 in it? If so, is there a possibility of a iatrogenic reaction?
So I think I understand what they're asking. MRC5 is a cell line If I don't know how many of you ever read that book, the life of Henrietta Lacks, where they talk about this woman whose cervical cancer was immortalized. That was Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks is the name of the book. And so that cell line was called HeLa cells, and that's a cancer cell line. And a lot of research has been done in the world on HeLa cancer cells. The MRC5 is a cancer, is not a cancer cell line. It's a type of cell called a fibroblast. And I think the reason why someone's asking is that that original cell came from an aborted fetus in like the 60s. And that cell line is often used in vaccine research. In fact, I think that cell line was used for the MMR vaccine. It's not like just for COVID vaccine. And I think some of the early research in the development of the vaccine used that cell line. That's not in the vaccine now. It was used in the research. And interestingly enough, the Vatican has weighed in on this, knowing that some people who have strong feelings about abortion may say, well, I'm not going to take the vaccine. And the Pope himself has actually said that this is that is not a reason not to take the vaccine. MRC5 is a cell line. It's not in the vaccine. Latrogenic, I think they mean iatrogenic. Iatrogenic means something bad that happens because a doctor did it to you. So I'm not sure. Yeah. So the latrogenic is not a word as far as I know. It's iatrogenic, and I'm not sure that part of the question. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that could have been their spell check acting up. Maybe it was the other term you mentioned. Yeah. Okay. Very good. Very good. Next question would be, 2 nights ago, CNN had a town hall with Dr. Fauci, and they discussed that the vaccines are now less effective with those people living with HIV. How do these vaccine variants affect those people?
Well, I think as we mentioned earlier, people with HIV and other types of things that compromise our immune system, those people don't respond as well to vaccines. They don't have the same robust response, but they will respond, and they are going to be protected. And so I think, again, they should certainly avail themselves to to taking the vaccine. Now, the second part of that question again, can you read that again, Brother Todd?
I guess the question was really, the question is the vaccines versus the variants versus.
Okay. So as far as the variants are concerned, which is a question for everyone, the variants do not cause disease that's going to be more severe. It's just that a person is at a higher risk for getting the disease. Just the transmissibility is greater. There's even been some talk recently about using multiple masks, possibly having 2 masks to have 2 layers of protection. So this is a problem for everyone, not only people who are immunocompromised, probably a bigger problem for people that are immunocompromised.
I do think it's important, and Dr. Hewlett mentioned about the subunit vaccine that's coming out from Johnson & Johnson. And they did their study internationally. So they had a cohort in the United States, a cohort in South Africa, and they had a cohort someplace else, somewhere in South America, I believe. And you saw the best effectiveness at preventing disease in the US, and you saw the lowest ability. So it was like 72% effective in the US. It was 50-something% effective in South Africa. And they said that's because that variant in South Africa that is more transmissible seems to elicit a lower immune response. And so when I first heard that news report, I got a little nervous, having gotten Moderna, and we don't have large studies showing how it works against some of these other variants. But then I realized that that was lower protection from mild, moderate, or severe disease. But when you looked at the prevention of severe disease, as Dr. Hewlett said, it was 85% effective. So, even though you may see less effectiveness in a variant at this point, and they are doing studies on maybe we're going to need a booster, I'm almost positive that we're going to need to change these vaccines over time. And thank goodness some of this technology is plug and play so it can happen quickly. But then the question is going to come up, when do you do it? When you have a production line that's pushing out one vaccine, when do you start? And you haven't even vaccinated the majority of Americans against that. When do you make that change? And do you add a booster? Do you change the vaccine itself? But it's important to notice that what I'm really worried about was getting sick and getting hospitalized and dying. If there's a variant out there that I'm more likely to get, a cold and some aches and pains, but I'm still not going to get hospitalized and I'm not going to die of it. I just think we need to put it in perspective. The J&J results were still a big success, but it does show that variant in South Africa in particular elicits less of an immune response. I think that virus, that mugshot has been changed enough. That virus is wearing a wig and a hat and a fake mustache, and our body is not responding to the same degree as it does to the other variants, but it still prevented people from dying. Nobody died on that trial. Nobody was vaccinated.
Gotcha. And Dr. Holcomb, I think you may have just answered this question, but I'll ask it. Maybe there's a different angle. The question is, will COVID-19 and its variants ever go away? Or is it something that we'll have to learn to live with and fight against indefinitely?
I think that's part of that foot race that Dr. Hewlett is talking about.
Yeah.
It's mutating fast. It's the question is, can we roll it out fast enough?
The thing I think people have to understand about coronaviruses is I think that the first coronaviruses were identified in the late 1960s. And coronaviruses as a group cause anywhere between 15 to 30% of the common colds. And so most of us have encountered coronaviruses. It's just that they were causing a rather benign disease. You get a cold, your nose is stuffy, you feel uncomfortable. Sometimes you still go to work, but maybe you'll stay at home for a day and then it goes away. Something happened, some mutation or something happened, and then all of a sudden the coronaviruses became able to cause severe disease. And as Dr. Holcomb said, back in 2003, we saw the first instance of that occurring, where you had a coronavirus that all of a sudden it was a cold virus on steroids, and it basically caused lots of death. And then in 2012, we saw another one. And now we have this one that, of course, is really wreaking havoc with the entire world. I think we're going to be facing these types of problems for a long time. I don't think we're going to be able to get rid of it completely, but I do think we will be able to control it, much like we were able to. We still haven't cured HIV, but we've at least controlled it.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and to give a shout out to the Obama administration. I mean, they really saw this coming, and they acted on what we had seen from MERS and because Ebola, MERS, and SARS, we really escaped a bullet on all three of those. And I think rather than just saying, they knew the difference between being lucky and being good, and they set up all this whole pandemic office to have a rapid response that was rolled back in 2016. And I think that we would have been clearly a lot better off had those things been in place. But I'm hoping going forward, we're going to be on top of our game going forward and never let that happen again.
It is taking a while. And I think, again, I don't want to get political, but when you look at what they're trying to do now with the Centers for Disease Control, you have Dr. Rochelle Walensky, who is extremely competent and capable, and she's essentially starting all over again with a lot of the policies that were put out that she disagreed with, that were sort of seem to be at variance with science. So I think we do have an opportunity now to start to turn things around.
Very good. Very good. Next question. As a rule, should somebody be tested for COVID before they are administered the vaccine?
No, they don't. We're not doing it routinely. They don't need to do that. The thing that we do ask when they come into our vaccine center at the health department is, were you recently diagnosed with COVID? Because if they are supposed to be on isolation, they shouldn't be in our building. And so they have to be off of isolation. Also, if someone is symptomatic, from anything, they shouldn't receive the vaccine while they're sick. So anybody who is feeling ill should defer having the vaccine. As long as they've recovered from COVID, then they certainly can have the vaccine. But we're not routinely testing people for antibodies or doing PCRs on individuals.
Gotcha. Next question. There have been reports of people developing Bell's palsy as a result of receiving the COVID-19 vaccine. Are there any confirmed cases of Bell's palsy as a reaction to the Moderna or Pfizer vaccine?
Yeah, there were, I think, some cases. I think that in the Moderna trials, I forget exactly how many there were, but they also saw, I think, some cases of Bell's palsy in the people that got the placebo as well. But it was what would be considered a very rare side effect of the vaccine. But it did in fact happen. I believe that it resolved, but it is on the record that it did happen.
Did happen. And I'm sorry, Dr. Hewlett, I forget my ignorance. What is Bell's palsy?
Bell's palsy is where you get partial paralysis of one side of your face, where one of the nerves, one of the cranial nerves, as we call it, possibly becomes inflamed. And this could be in a reaction or in response. The most in Westchester County and in the Northeast, the disease Lyme disease has been associated with a Bell's palsy type picture. In the days before Lyme disease, herpes infections could cause Bell's palsy. And for some reason, it may well be that this particular infection could cause it as well. But it is usually it's reversible, and that was the case with in this situation.
I see.
Yeah, and I'd like to also state that this is not unique to COVID vaccines. The seasonal flu vaccine has a risk of Bell's palsy that's less than 1 in a million, but it's there. So if you vaccinated 300 million Americans and something had a frequency that's below 1 in a million, you may still see 200 people in the country develop this side effect. But the question is, before the needle goes in your arm, the risk to you is still less than 1 in a million.
Gotcha. Okay, very good. Yeah, I thought that might be the case when you mentioned that even some of the people that were on the placebo developed it.
Yes.
Right. Okay. I believe we only have one more question on the table right now from our general Q&A section. And that question is, how soon after the second shot is a person deemed to be protected from the virus?
Generally, we believe probably after at least 2 weeks. It may be slightly longer, but it's generally stated that after a period of about 2 weeks, you probably have a fairly good level of protection there.
Okay. Very good. Very good. Well, again, I believe that was our last general Q&A question put forth by the audience. Really want to thank the audience for being so engaged. Great questions. Great questions. And we're doing well on time. We're coming up on 1:50 and we had 2 hours. If there are no other questions.
Looks like there was one question I saw in the chat about whether people who are on dialysis
Oh, I didn't see that. Okay.
can receive the vaccine, and the answer would be yes. Just for the benefit of people that are on the call, our dialysis patients, we always worry about them because they are considered to be immunocompromised. And so we encourage our dialysis patients to take vaccines to prevent infections from occurring, because infections can be much more serious in our dialysis population.
Very good. I'm laughing, brothers, because some people are coming down the stretch. It's over. Let me get my questions in. Okay. First question: how do we define protection?
Protection is, it depends what you want to study. You can only make claims that you've studied and proven. And so the claims of protection for these two vaccines can be found in the study design. And before they carried out the study, they said, this is what we're going to look at. We're going to look to see what's the real problem here? What is stressing out our healthcare system? What's leading to these deaths? And they said, well, symptomatic COVID infection seems to be the most pressing issue. This is what is killing all these people. This is what's stressing our healthcare system to the brink. That became the endpoint. They call that the primary endpoint of the study. And in these two studies, we can say there's 95% protection against that thing, against the symptomatic COVID infection. But if you ask somebody, said, well, is protection defined as the ability not to pass it on to someone else? You have to do a study that looks at that, and then you can make a claim about that. So one of the things that we really tried to do here today is to limit our comments to, as Dragnet would say, just the facts. And we're not going to overstate things, and we're not going to understate things. But so our definitions of protection came from the study designs.
And I'll add to that as time goes on, because this was done over a very short period of time, you typically will develop what we call correlates. And so once you've done studies and they've actually measured the levels of these antibodies, and they've measured the responses of the T cells in the various recipients, and you basically can look longitudinally over time and see, do people still develop the infection in the coming years? And you can develop what we call a correlate with protection based upon an antibody level. And so that's something that's going to happen in the future, but we don't have that information now.
Understood.
I want to go back to something we were discussing a little bit earlier, because it occurred to me when I was talking about study design. When you look at side effects from vaccines, you can make a statement that says, well, the people who got placebo had this percentage of them have this side effect, and the people who got a actual vaccine had this percentage. You can compare those two percentages to see if they're different, statistically different, and then you can compare it to see if it's different from what you'd expect in the background. Mm-hmm. I want to go back to Bell's palsy just to say, I don't know if the people who got Bell's palsy on the vaccine arm was caused by the vaccine. I can say that the thing that caught a lot of people's attention was that there were cases of Bell's palsy in both placebo and vaccine arms, but in both the Moderna and the Pfizer trial, there was more people on the vaccine arm than the placebo arm that got Bell's palsy. On both arms, it was still within what you'd expect to see if you just randomly looked at 30,000 people. How many of them would develop a Bell's palsy? And so that I want to get that across, that we're talking associations, causal relationships. I don't think you can say from something that has such a small incidence. I don't know if that clarifies. So I don't know if the vaccine causes Bell's palsy. It appears to be extremely rare whether you got a placebo or a vaccine, but on both studies, it was more in the vaccine arm than the placebo arm.
Very good. Okay, I think we have time for two more questions. First one here would be, if you miss your deadline on the second shot, what are the consequences?
Okay, that's an excellent question. And I think a lot of people are losing sleep about this, because at this time of the year, if you have a snowstorm and you're scheduled to come in the day of the snowstorm, what happens? There is a window of about 4 days, in either direction. So if you came in 4 days early, or if you came in 4 days later, it's believed that that's going to be okay. We encourage everybody, and at our health department, we basically, one of the first questions we ask is, can you come back 28 days from now? Because we happen to be given the Moderna vaccine. So we really try to emphasize you need to come back on the day you're scheduled. But that 4-day window is believed to be acceptable. The CDC has actually said that in extreme circumstances, if a person is a week or two late, they still should be offered the vaccine. I think that everyone is trying to just emphasize the fact that it's important for you to make this a priority. So when people come to the health department, they say, well, I can't come back at day 28 because I'm going to Florida. So we tell them, okay, if it's more important for you to go to Florida, then you come back after you return from Florida. So if it's some really pressing thing that prevents them from coming, then that's when you make the exceptions, but you try to get people in the mindset that you want to prioritize about this.
Gotcha. All right, and I think we're coming up on our last question. Has it been, well, do you feel that this will be a one-time vaccine, or is this going to be an ailment that we'll have to get an annual shot for, like the flu?
Well, I can give my answer, and I'm interested to hear what Dr. Holcomb has to say. I think we're going to have to monitor this. We really don't have an answer for this right now. I think that the most important thing for us right now is to try to get to that herd immunity. And I think that we generally believe that we are going to have protection of a large part of our population for a period of time, and we're going to be able to then monitor and see what the impact of the vaccine is. But I don't think we really know at this point whether this is going to turn out to be something like influenza, where we have to give it either annually or maybe every 5 years or something like that. We really don't know.
Yeah, I would point people to look at MERS. We never developed a vaccine against MERS. It went away. And I don't think there's been any cases since that initial outbreak. Brother Hewlett, has MERS been seen since 2009?
I think they report just, occasional cases. I think it has to do with the fact that it was what they called an animal vector, where you had the camels actually that were carrying this particular virus, and it crossed over into humans, and so it was a lot easier to control.
I guess my point is, though, these infectious diseases in general, I think is probably one of the things that maybe attracted you to the field in this way is it's interesting in that they can flare up and then go back down by reasons that we don't really completely understand. We see it with Ebola. Ebola outbreaks just flare up and fizzle out and flare up again. And I've always been amazed at how that happens just naturally.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, doctors, I can't tell you how much we appreciate this knowledge you've shared with us today. It is truly invaluable. Information is power. We say that all the time. And today, I think we've actually led to some people actually having that much more in the way of power, because there was a ton of information actually imparted today. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you all.
Thank
Yes,
you.
it was a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. Yes.
Well, and I also want to thank our audience for being so engaged. It's a learning exercise. We have to actually be in this together. And today there was a very good partnership between the medical community and the citizenry at large. So this is what has to happen if we're going to defeat this virus. Well, that concludes today's formal program. I'd like to thank Dr. Holcomb and Dr. Hewlett for their excellent presentations, and for all of you for logging in and staying informed. I'm sure I speak for all D9 members when I say it is our truest purposes to promote brotherhood and sisterhood within our organizations, but also serve our communities. And to that end, it was our privilege to host this webinar for all of you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, I just want to make one other quick point. If you have any comments that you'd like to make about today's presentations, especially good ones, we'd like for everybody to maybe drop us an email at the following email address. Is the slide ready? Yes, right there. moac1911@gmail.com. moac1911@gmail.com. End slide. All right. So, doctors, do you have any final words before we part?
Just everyone stay safe, and please, if you're eligible, go in and get your vaccine. If you're not yet eligible, just follow the guidance in your particular region or state, and as soon as you're eligible, take the vaccine. A lot of people are asking, well, which one should I take? And the answer is whichever one they're offering, take it.
Yes, and I would say just as a logistical thing, go on multiple wait lists if you can. Find out how many different places you can get your name on a list, and get your name on all of them. I have lots of patients doing this, and I see some of them getting appointments in April, and others playing the technology, and they're coming up in March and late February. So you do have to be diligent about it. And if you have trouble with technology, get somebody to help you with it.
Very good. Very good. Well, all right then. Well, thank you again to all the attendees for tuning in. And on behalf of the brothers of Maplewood-Oranges alumni in our Northeastern province, we like to say, please be safe, please stay informed, and blessings to you and yours. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Go.
Okay.